They told her she was digging her own grave. In a way, they were right. Except it turned out to be everyone else's salvation. Montana Territory, October of 1887. The first time Eleanor Brooks struck her pickaxe into the frozen hillside behind her dead husband's cabin, her neighbor, Thomas Harlan, rode up on his chestnut mare and sat watching her for a full 15 minutes before speaking. "You digging your own grave, Eleanor?" Eleanor didn't stop swinging. The pickaxe rose and fell with the rhythm of someone who had already decided that stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant the kind of pain that had no bottom. Harlan shifted in his saddle, leather creaking in the cold air. "You know there's nothing in that hill worth finding. Prospectors checked it years back. Nothing but clay and frozen earth." Eleanor paused only long enough to wipe frost from her eyebrows with the back of her gloved hand. "I'm not looking for gold." "Then what in God's name are you doing?" "Building a home." Harlan laughed, a sharp dismissive sound that made Eleanor's dog, Ash, lift his grizzled shepherd head and growl low in his throat. "A home in a hill. Ma'am, with all due respect, your husband left you that cabin not 100 yards from here. It's got 4 walls, a roof, and a stove. What more does a widow need?" Eleanor stopped then. She turned to face Harlan fully, her eyes the color of winter sky just before snow. Her face was thinner than it had been 8 months ago, sharper, carved down to something essential and unyielding. "My husband is dead, Mr. Harlan. My son is dead. That cabin has walls so thin I can hear every ghost that walks through it. Last winter, I burned every piece of furniture we owned and still woke with ice in my hair. The cold came through those walls like they were made of paper. This winter, I'm going to sleep warm. I'm going to do it underground where winter can't follow me." Harlan shook his head slowly, the way men do when they've decided a woman has lost her senses and there's no point in conversation. "Suit yourself, Mrs. Brooks. But when that hill comes down on your head, don't expect anyone to come digging you out. We've got our own families to worry about." He turned his mare and rode away without looking back, his coat collar turned up against the October wind that was already promising something worse than anyone wanted to believe. Eleanor returned to her work. The pickaxe rose and fell. The hillside slowly opened, one swing at a time, and Ash sat watching with patient brown eyes, waiting for his human to build them a place where winter couldn't follow. James Brooks had died in February, 3 days after the fever took hold. Their son, Samuel, barely 9 months old, had followed him before the week was out. The town had helped at first. Food appeared on the porch. Firewood was stacked without explanation. The pastor had come to pray, the women to clean, the men to offer advice Eleanor hadn't asked for and wouldn't take. By March, the visits had stopped. By April, people crossed the street when they saw her coming. By May, Eleanor understood that grief made people uncomfortable in ways death never did. The dead were buried and finished. Grief was alive and watching, and it reminded everyone that the same thing could happen to them, that fever didn't care about good intentions or clean living or how much you loved the people sleeping in the beds beside you. She could have sold the claim and moved to town. She could have found work as a seamstress or taken in washing or found some respectable way to fade into the background of other people's lives. The sensible widows did this. The acceptable widows did this. Eleanor was done being sensible. She had grown up in a mining family in Pennsylvania, where her father and 3 brothers had spent their lives crawling through tunnels carved into the earth. She had heard their stories around the supper table every night of her childhood. Stories of chambers that stayed the same temperature year-round, cool in summer and warm in winter, protected from the storms that raged uselessly above ground. She had visited the mine entrances herself as a girl, had stood at the threshold where daylight gave way to darkness and felt the strange comfort of air that didn't burn with heat or bite with cold. She had never forgotten that lesson. The earth protects what goes deep enough. The first day of digging, Eleanor worked until her hands bled through her gloves. The frozen hillside fought her. Every swing of the pickaxe sent shocks up her arms that made her teeth ache. The earth was hard as iron this close to winter, reluctant to give way. But Eleanor had learned in the 8 months since the funerals that pain was just another kind of weather. You couldn't stop it. You could only decide whether to stand in it or find shelter. She swung until the sun dropped behind the mountains and the temperature fell so fast she could hear the trees cracking. Then she gathered her tools, called Ash, and walked back to the cabin she hated. That night she sat by the stove and wrapped her bleeding hands and stared at the wall where Samuel's cradle had been before she'd burned it for warmth. The second day, Martha Hayward rode out from town. Martha had been Eleanor's closest friend once, back when Eleanor had been someone who had friends, someone who smiled at church socials and brought pies to barn raisings and fit into the shape of a life that made sense to other people. Martha dismounted carefully, as if approaching something wild that might bolt. "Eleanor," she called out. "Eleanor, please stop for a moment. I need to talk to you." Eleanor kept digging. The pickaxe had found a seam in the hillside, a place where the earth was willing to crack open, and she wasn't going to lose the momentum. Martha came closer, picking her way carefully over the broken ground. "Eleanor, people are worried about you. This isn't right. This isn't healthy. You need to come back to town. You need to be around people who care about you." Eleanor drove the pickaxe into the hillside with enough force to send chips of frozen clay scattering. She turned to face Martha, her breath coming in white clouds. "The people who cared about me stopped coming in March. The people who cared about me decided that grief was catching and I was too sad to be around. So don't tell me about people who care, Martha. Tell me about people who can't stand to look at what they're afraid of becoming." Martha's face crumpled. "That's not fair, Eleanor. We didn't know what to say. We didn't know how to help you. You could have just sat with me. You could have just been there without needing to fix anything or say anything wise. But you couldn't do that, could you? Because my dead baby reminded you that yours could die too. My dead husband reminded you that yours could leave you just as quick. So you all decided it was easier to pretend I didn't exist." Martha was crying now, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But this digging, this madness, this isn't the answer." Eleanor picked up the pickaxe again. "Maybe not. But it's my answer. And it's the only one I've got." Martha left without another word. Eleanor didn't watch her go. She just kept swinging, and Ash kept watch, and the hillside kept opening one stubborn inch at a time. By the third day, word had spread through town. The Brooks widow had lost her mind. She was digging into the hillside like an animal, building some kind of burrow. Someone said she was trying to dig down to where her husband and baby were buried, as if grief had confused her sense of direction, and she thought the cemetery was underground instead of across the valley. Someone else said she was planning to bury herself alive, that this was just suicide by another name. The children were warned to stay away from her. "Don't go near the hill woman," mothers told their sons and daughters. "Don't speak to her. Don't look at her too long. Grief can spread if you're not careful." Eleanor heard the whispers when she came to town for supplies. She saw the way people pulled their children close when she walked past. She felt the weight of their judgment and their fear and their relief that this terrible thing had happened to her and not to them. She bought lamp oil and candles and dried beans and said nothing. She loaded her purchases onto the small cart, clicked her tongue at Ash, and walked back to the hillside that was becoming something other than earth. The first week of digging stripped everything soft away. Eleanor's hands developed calluses on top of blisters on top of calluses. Her shoulders burned with an ache that never fully faded. Her back complained every morning when she forced herself out of bed, every evening when she finally stopped swinging. She lost weight she didn't have to lose. Her dresses hung loose. Her face became all edges and angles. But the chamber grew. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the earth gave way. She learned the rhythm of it, where to strike, where to pry, where to let the natural seams in the clay guide the shape of the space. She learned that frozen earth was harder but cleaner, that it held its shape better than the soft mud that would come with spring. She learned that her father had been right. The earth 3 feet down was warmer than the air above it. The earth 6 feet down was warmer still. She worked sunrise to sunset, breaking only when her body absolutely demanded it. Ash stayed close, sometimes sitting at the entrance to watch her work, sometimes venturing into town on his own and returning with scraps of food that kind strangers slipped him when they thought no one was looking. The dog had always been smarter than most people. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had carved a chamber roughly 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide. It wasn't much. It wasn't finished. But it was enough to test the truth she'd been betting her life on. That night, as the October cold settled over the valley like something with weight and teeth, Eleanor carried a lantern and a blanket down into the earth. Ash followed without hesitation, his nails clicking on the packed clay floor. She hung the lantern on a root she'd left jutting from the wall for exactly this purpose. She spread the blanket on the ground. She lay down with Ash curled against her side, his warmth adding to the warmth that was already there, rising from the earth itself. Above ground, the wind screamed. Above ground, the temperature dropped below freezing and kept falling. Above ground, the cabin stood empty and cold, its thin walls no match for the season that was coming. Below ground, Eleanor closed her eyes. The earth held her. The earth was warmer than air, warmer than wood, warmer than the best stove she'd ever owned. The earth asked nothing of her. It didn't need her to smile or to heal or to be anything other than what she was, a woman who had lost everything and refused to lose herself. For the first time since the funerals, Eleanor Brooks slept through the night without waking. No ghosts walked through her dreams. No fever called to her from the darkness. No empty cradle creaked in the corner of a room that no longer existed. She slept deep and warm and silent, wrapped in earth that had been waiting millions of years to keep someone safe. When she woke, frost covered the world above. But down in the chamber she was building, down in the grave they said she was digging, the air was still. The temperature hadn't changed. The earth had kept its promise. Eleanor sat up slowly, her hand resting on Ash's gray muzzle. The dog looked at her with eyes that understood everything and judged nothing. "They can call it madness," Eleanor whispered to him. "They can call it a grave. But we know what it really is." Ash's tail thumped once against the ground. Eleanor stood, brushed clay from her dress, and climbed back into the daylight that was already too cold and getting colder. She picked up her pickaxe. She found the place where yesterday's work had ended. She lifted the tool above her head. And she kept digging. The second week, Eleanor's hands stopped bleeding. The skin had toughened into something closer to leather than flesh, calloused and cracked but functional. She worked through the pain until the pain became just another constant, like hunger or cold or the weight of silence that followed her everywhere she went. The chamber expanded. What had started as a single room carved into the hillside became something more deliberate, more permanent. Eleanor dug a second chamber behind the first, then a third branching off to the side. She reinforced the walls with timber she salvaged from an abandoned claim 2 miles north, wood that nobody wanted because the mine had played out and the prospector had died. She dragged the beams back herself, one at a time, Ash trotting beside her with his ears alert for threats that never came. The ventilation shaft was the hardest part. Eleanor remembered her father's stories about miners who had suffocated in chambers that looked safe, who had burned through all the air without realizing it until it was too late to climb out. She spent 3 full days digging a narrow tunnel from the main chamber up through 15 feet of earth, angling it so the opening would be hidden behind a cluster of scrub pine on the far side of the hill. She lined it with stones to keep it from collapsing. She covered the opening with branches that would let smoke out but keep snow from coming in. When she tested it by burning a small fire in the main chamber, the smoke rose perfectly, invisible against the gray October sky. Anyone looking would see nothing. Anyone listening would hear nothing. The shelter was becoming what she needed it to be, a place the world couldn't find. By the 3rd week, the town's gossip had evolved from concern to condemnation. The pastor, Reverend Clayton, mentioned her by name in his Sunday sermon. He didn't call her Eleanor. He called her a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when grief is allowed to fester without the guidance of faith and community. He spoke about souls that turn away from God's light and burrow into darkness like animals. Everyone knew who he meant. Several people nodded in agreement. One woman said amen loud enough for the whole congregation to hear. Martha Hayward sat in the 3rd pew and said nothing, but her hands twisted in her lap like they were fighting each other. That same week, Eleanor came back from gathering firewood to find rocks scattered around the entrance to her shelter. Some of them had been thrown hard enough to chip the timber supports. The message was clear even without words. The children had been here. The children had been taught that what she was doing was wrong, and children always found ways to punish what they'd been taught to fear. Eleanor picked up the rocks one by one and used them to reinforce the fire pit she was building in the main chamber. Waste nothing. Her father had taught her that too. The 4th week brought the first hard frost. It came early, even for Montana, coating everything in white before October was finished. The town took notice, but didn't take it seriously. Early frost didn't mean anything. Weather was unpredictable this close to the mountains. One cold night didn't make a brutal winter. Eleanor watched the frost and said nothing. She had learned that warning people who didn't want to hear was the same as talking to the wind. Both were wastes of breath. Instead, she worked. She carved a storage room deep into the hillside, a space where the temperature would stay just above freezing all winter long. Perfect for preserving food. She lined the floor with stones and the walls with clay she had mixed with water and let harden. She built shelves from salvaged wood. She began filling those shelves with everything she could gather or trade for or buy with the last of the money James had saved before the fever took him. Dried beans. Salted pork. Smoked fish she traded for with a Crow woman who came through town twice a year and didn't ask questions about why Eleanor needed so much. Flour in sealed tins. Cornmeal. Honey that wouldn't spoil. Apples she dried herself in the thin October sun. Potatoes she buried in sand to keep them from sprouting. Onions hung in bundles from the ceiling. Candles. Lamp oil. Matches wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. She worked methodically, without hurry but without rest. Every day the shelter became more complete. Every day it became more capable of keeping someone alive when the world above ground became incapable of supporting life. The town, meanwhile, prepared the way they always prepared. They stacked firewood in neat cords beside their homes. They checked their chimneys. They slaughtered hogs and cured the meat. They did what had always worked before, confident that this winter would be like all the others, cold but survivable, hard but familiar. Eleanor saw Thomas Harlan in town one afternoon in early November. He was loading supplies onto his wagon, his breath misting in air that had turned cold enough to burn. He glanced at her once, then looked away quickly, as if eye contact might obligate him to acknowledge what everyone else had decided to ignore. She didn't try to speak to him. There was nothing left to say. He had made his judgment. The whole town had made theirs. Eleanor was the mad widow in the hill, and that was the end of the story as far as they were concerned. What they didn't see was how closely she was watching the world around her. How she noticed the birds that should have been there weren't anymore. How the geese had flown south 3 weeks earlier than usual, their formations scattered and urgent. How the squirrels were gathering food with a frantic energy she had never seen before, their cheeks stuffed so full they could barely climb. How the deer had moved down from the high country in the first week of November, something they normally didn't do until late December. The animals knew. The animals always knew. They didn't have the luxury of denial or the comfort of tradition. They only had instinct, and instinct was screaming that something was coming. Eleanor listened. She prepared. She said nothing. In the second week of November, an old trapper named Dutch Keller rode up to Eleanor's hillside on a mule so ancient it looked like it had been alive when the mountains were young. Dutch was somewhere past 70, weathered and bent, with a beard that reached halfway down his chest and eyes that had seen more winters than most people survived. He sat on his mule for a long time, watching Eleanor work. She was reinforcing the entrance with a door she'd built from heavy pine planks, fitted so carefully that no light would escape when it was closed, no cold would seep in. "You feel it too, don't you?" Dutch said finally. It wasn't a question. "In your bones." Eleanor stopped working. She looked at the old man, and for the first time in months, she saw someone who wasn't looking at her with pity or judgment or fear. Dutch was just looking at her like one person who understood something looking at another person who understood the same thing. "Yes," she said simply. Dutch nodded slowly. "This winter is going to be a killer. Worst I've felt coming in 50 years of watching seasons turn. The animals know it. The sky knows it. Hell, even the rocks know it if you listen right." Eleanor set down her hammer. "Are you preparing?" Dutch laughed, but there was no humor in it. "At my age, preparing means making peace with the fact that I might not see spring. I've got my cabin and my traps and my whiskey, and that's all I've got time to manage. But you," he gestured at the hillside, "you're building something that'll last. Something that'll hold." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Dutch turned his mule to leave, then paused. "When it comes, and it will come, don't you feel guilty about who you do or don't let in. You built this for yourself. Anyone who mocked you for it has no right to the shelter you made with your own hands. You remember that." He rode away before Eleanor could respond, the mule's hooves crunching through frost that hadn't melted since it fell 3 days ago. Eleanor stood alone on the hillside with Ash sitting beside her, and for a moment she let herself imagine what was coming. She let herself imagine the cold that would make this November frost feel like summer. She let herself imagine the people who had turned their backs on her, realizing too late that she had been right all along. Then she shook her head, picked up her hammer, and went back to work. Imagining changed nothing. Only preparation mattered. The third week of November brought the first snow. Not the light dusting that sometimes came and melted by afternoon. This was heavy, wet, wrong. It fell for 2 days straight, piling up faster than it had any right to in November. 8 inches. 10. 12. The trees bent under the weight. Several broke with sounds like gunshots echoing across the valley. The town watched the snow and talked about how unusual it was, how strange, how early. But they still weren't worried. Not really. Snow melted. Weather changed. This was Montana. You expected surprises. Eleanor sealed the final entrance to her shelter. The door fit perfectly, heavy and solid, with a bar on the inside that would hold against anything short of an axe. She had carved a small opening near the bottom, just large enough for Ash to come and go if he needed to, with a cover she could slide shut from inside. On the last day of November, with snow still falling and the temperature dropping into ranges that made thermometers useless, Eleanor loaded the last of her supplies into the shelter. She made 3 trips, carrying everything she owned that mattered. Blankets, food, tools, the lamp that had been her mother's. A small bundle of letters James had written to her when they were courting, the only thing she had kept from the cabin besides the clothes on her back. When everything was inside, she stood at the entrance one last time and looked at the valley below. The town was mostly hidden by snow and distance, just a few smoke trails rising from chimneys, dark lines against darker clouds. Lights flickered in windows. Life continued down there, ordinary and oblivious. Eleanor called Ash. The dog came immediately, shaking snow from his thick coat. Together they descended into the earth. Eleanor pulled the door closed behind them. The bar dropped into place with a sound that felt final as a coffin lid. Darkness swallowed them. Then Eleanor lit a lamp, and warm yellow light pushed back the shadows. The main chamber glowed. The storage room beyond was stocked and ready. The sleeping chamber she had carved at the very back had blankets piled thick and a small fire pit that vented through a secondary shaft she had dug specifically for that space. The earth wrapped around them. The temperature held steady, cool but not cold, still but not stale. The shelter breathed through its hidden vents. It held them the way it had promised it would. Eleanor sat on the floor with her back against the wall and Ash curled beside her. Above ground, snow continued to fall. Above ground, winter was coming with teeth sharper than anyone wanted to believe. Below ground, Eleanor closed her eyes and waited. The cold arrived like something alive and hungry. It came in the first week of December, 3 weeks earlier than the worst winter anyone in the valley could remember. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single night. 40 degrees between sunset and dawn, falling so fast that water froze in buckets inside homes, that breath crystallized and fell to the ground like broken glass. Thomas Harlan woke that morning to find his youngest daughter shivering so hard her teeth were cracking against each other. The fire in their stove had died sometime in the night. When he tried to restart it, he discovered the chimney had cracked from the cold, and smoke filled the cabin faster than flame. He got his family out, for children and his wife, all of them wrapped in every blanket they owned, and led them through snow that was already waist-deep to his brother's house a quarter-mile away. His brother's house was warmer, but not by much. The walls were thicker, but thickness meant nothing when the cold was this determined. They burned furniture to keep the fire high. They burned books. They burned a chest that had belonged to Thomas's grandfather, imported all the way from Boston, worth more than everything else they owned combined. It kept them warm for 3 hours. All over the valley, the same scenes played out. Families huddled together. Fires burned too hot and consumed too much. Livestock that had survived blizzards before froze standing in their barns, their breath turning to ice in their lungs before they could even fall. By the second day, the pastor's wife had stopped breathing. She had been sick with a cough all fall, and the cold found that weakness and exploited it. Reverend Clayton held her body until it grew stiff, then had to leave her in an unheated room because there was no way to dig a grave in ground frozen solid as iron. By the third day, people started counting who was left. 4 dead. 7. 11. The numbers climbed every morning when someone didn't wake up or when exposure claimed someone who had ventured outside looking for firewood that didn't exist. Martha Hayward's youngest son developed frostbite on his hands and feet despite never leaving the house. The cold came through the walls. It came through the floor. It came through every crack and gap and space that had seemed inconsequential in normal winters. Martha wrapped him in blankets and held him close and prayed to a God who didn't seem to be listening. On the 5th day, someone saw smoke. Not the thick black smoke of desperate fires burning wet wood and furniture and anything combustible. Thin white smoke, barely visible against the gray sky, rising from somewhere up in the hills where no one should be alive. Thomas Harlan saw it first. He was outside trying to chip ice from the well when he noticed the trail, almost invisible, coming from the direction of Eleanor Brooks's old claim. He stared at it for a long time, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. She couldn't still be alive. Not up there. Not in whatever hole she had dug. But the smoke was real. The smoke meant fire. Fire meant warmth. Warmth meant life. He told his brother. His brother told the pastor. The pastor told everyone who could still walk. By nightfall, desperate people were making desperate plans. The 6th day brought the coldest night anyone had ever felt. The kind of cold that didn't just hurt. It killed. It killed quickly and without mercy. Wind screamed down from the mountains like something with consciousness and malice. Trees exploded from the ice expanding in their trunks. The sound was like rifle fire, sharp and sudden, all night long. In town, people burned their last reserves. They burned their children's beds. They burned family photographs. They burned anything that would delay the inevitable for another hour. And then, past midnight, when the cold had reached depths that made hell sound warm by comparison, Thomas Harlan led a group of 23 people up through snow that tried to kill them with every step. Men, women, children, all of them wrapped in every piece of fabric they could find, all of them stumbling through darkness toward a hope so thin it was almost invisible. They followed the direction the smoke had come from, though there was no smoke now. The wind had scattered it, or the fire had gone out, or they were wrong about what they had seen. But they had no other options. This was the only chance left. Eleanor Brooks's madness or death by morning. Those were the choices. They found the entrance because Thomas Harlan remembered where the cabin had been, and he remembered Eleanor standing in front of that hillside with a pickaxe in her hands. They found it because desperation is its own kind of sight. The door was hidden behind snow and scrub pine, so carefully concealed that they almost missed it. But Martha Hayward, carrying her youngest son whose feet had gone black with frostbite, saw the straight edge in the curve of the hill. Saw the thing that shouldn't be there. She fell to her knees and started digging with bare hands that had no feeling left in them. Others joined her. They clawed through snow and ice until the door was visible, heavy pine planks fitted tight, a bar holding it closed from the inside. Thomas Harlan pounded on the door with fists that were frozen solid. "Eleanor," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Eleanor, please. Please open the door." Nothing. Silence. Just wind and the sound of children crying from cold that had gone past pain into something worse. Martha pressed her face against the frozen wood. "Eleanor, I'm sorry. We're sorry. Please. My son is dying. We're all dying. Please." Still nothing. Thomas pounded harder, putting his shoulder into it, but the door didn't move. It was built to hold. It was built to keep the world out. Then, from inside, a sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on a floor that shouldn't exist. The group of freezing people held their breath. Children stopped crying. Adults stopped moving. Everything stopped except the wind and the terrible cold and the sound of someone approaching the door from the other side. Inside the shelter, Eleanor stood with her hand on the bar that held the door closed. She had heard them coming 10 minutes ago, heard their voices rising through the ventilation shaft, heard Thomas Harlan calling her name like a prayer he didn't believe in. She had not moved. She had stood frozen, not from cold but from something colder. The memory of every person who had turned away from her. Every child who had thrown rocks. Every whispered conversation that had stopped when she entered a room. Every judgment, every dismissal, every moment of cruelty dressed up as concern. Ash sat beside her, whining softly. The dog didn't understand human grudges. He only understood that people were suffering on the other side of the door. Eleanor's hand trembled on the bar. She thought about Dutch Keller's words. Don't feel guilty about who you do or don't let in. You built this for yourself. She thought about her son, 9 months old, burning with fever while the townspeople had brought food and prayers, but no cure. She thought about James, strong and healthy one day and dead 3 days later. She thought about how God and community and faith had failed them both, and how the only thing that had saved her was her own refusal to rely on either. Outside, Thomas Harlan had stopped pounding. His voice came through the door, quieter now, broken. Eleanor, if you can hear me, I know we failed you. I know we were cruel. I know we don't deserve this. But these children, they didn't fail you. They're just cold. They're just dying. Please. Eleanor closed her eyes. She saw Samuel's face, small and perfect and gone. She saw the empty cradle. She saw the grave she had dug with hands that were still learning how to hold tools. Then she saw something else. She saw children on the other side of the door who had never done anything except listen to adults who should have known better. She saw people who were learning the lesson she had learned 8 months ago. That preparation matters more than pride. That survival doesn't care about your beliefs. That the world doesn't owe you mercy just because you think you deserve it. Eleanor opened her eyes. She lifted the bar. She pulled the door open. 23 people fell into the shelter like water through a broken dam. They collapsed on the floor, some crying, some too cold to cry, some unconscious and carried by others who had nothing left but the strength to drag one more body 1 more foot. Eleanor stepped back and let them come. She didn't speak. She just moved to the fire pit and began building up the flame with which she had stored for exactly this moment. Heat filled the main chamber. Light pushed back shadows that had been hiding frozen faces and blue fingers and skin that had started the terrible process of dying from the outside in. Martha Hayward crawled toward the fire, her son clutched against her chest. Eleanor, she sobbed. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry. We're all so sorry. Eleanor said nothing. She just added more wood to the fire and went to the storage room to gather blankets she had made and food she had preserved and water she had collected from snow melted slowly over carefully managed flames. The shelter held them all. It had been designed for 1 person and 1 dog, but Earth is generous when it needs to be. The chambers that Eleanor had carved expanded to fit 23 people who had nowhere else to go. They packed together like refugees, like survivors, like people who had finally learned the difference between the two. Children stopped crying as warmth returned to their limbs. Adults stopped shaking as the fire drove back the cold that had almost claimed them. The pastor sat in a corner with his wife's body wrapped in a blanket because he couldn't leave her behind and couldn't bury her in frozen ground. He didn't pray. He just sat and stared at nothing. Thomas Harlan found Eleanor in the storage room, gathering more supplies. He stood in the doorway, his face hollowed out by cold and shame. I don't know what to say to you. Eleanor looked at him with eyes that had cried themselves empty months ago. Then don't say anything. Just sit down and get warm. But I need you to know that I was wrong. We were all wrong. What you did, it saved us. You saved us. Eleanor picked up a basket of dried apples and moved past him into the main chamber. I didn't do it to save you. I did it to save myself. You just happened to be here when the cold came. She distributed food to people who hadn't eaten in days. She showed Martha how to warm her son's feet slowly, carefully, without the shock that could damage tissue beyond repair. She gave the pastor a blanket for his wife's body and didn't comment on the tears running down his frozen face. The night passed in silence, punctuated by crackling fire and the sound of people breathing who had almost stopped breathing forever. Outside, the wind screamed. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. Outside, cabins collapsed under the weight of ice and snow. Outside, the world ended in a way that it had ended before and would end again, indifferent and absolute. Inside, 23 people learned what Eleanor had known all along. The earth protects what goes deep enough. The storm lasted 6 more days. 6 days when the only people alive in the valley were the ones sheltering in Eleanor Brooks's underground refuge. 6 days when the fire never went out and the food never ran empty and the cold never reached the chambers carved deep enough to escape it. On the second day, children who had been too cold to move started playing in the corners, their voices echoing off clay walls in a sound that was almost like laughter. On the third day, Martha's son's feet began to heal, the black fading to red, then pink, then something close to normal. On the fourth day, the pastor spoke for the first time since arriving, asking Eleanor if she had any prayers or scripture she wanted read. She told him no, but he could read if it helped him. On the fifth day, Ash let the children pet him, his tail thumping against the packed earth floor as small hands buried themselves in his thick coat. On the sixth day, Thomas Harlan helped Eleanor expand the sleeping chamber, digging with tools she provided, working in silence that didn't need to be filled. On the seventh day, the wind stopped. The terrible sound that had been constant for a week cut off suddenly, leaving a silence so complete it hurt to hear. People looked at each other with questions on their faces. Eleanor climbed to the entrance, opened the door a crack, and looked out at a world transformed. Snow had buried everything. The valley was unrecognizable, a white expanse that showed no sign of human habitation. Where cabins had stood were mounds of snow that could have been anything. Where streets had run were smooth drifts that wind had carved into shapes like frozen waves. The sky was clear. The temperature was rising. The storm had broken. Eleanor turned back to the people crowded in her shelter. "We can go out now. Those of you who want to. Those who have somewhere to go." No one moved. They all knew what waited above ground. Homes destroyed. Livestock dead. Supplies gone. A town that would have to be rebuilt from nothing if it was going to be rebuilt at all. Martha spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. "Will you help us? Will you teach us?" Eleanor looked at the woman who had been her friend, who had abandoned her, who had come back when there was no other choice. "Teach you what?" "How to build. How to prepare. How to dig deep enough to survive." Eleanor was silent for a long time. Then she nodded once. "Yes, I'll teach you." The rebuilding took all winter and into spring. People moved slowly at first, digging out from snow that had to be shoveled and chipped and hauled away before anything else could be done. They found bodies. They found wreckage. They found a town that had trusted in walls and fire and tradition, and had learned those things meant nothing when winter decided to show its teeth. But they also found something else. They found that Eleanor Brooks's shelter still stood, still held warmth, still offered refuge to anyone willing to descend into the earth. Dutch Keller appeared in late January, riding his ancient mule through snow that had finally started to melt. He took one look at the people living in Eleanor's shelter and the new chambers they were digging beside it and started laughing. The sound echoed off the hillside like something wild and free. "I knew you'd save them," he said to Eleanor. "Even though they didn't deserve it. Even though you had every right to let them freeze." Eleanor shrugged. "I didn't save them. The earth did. I just showed them where to go." Others began digging. Families who had survived by luck or by huddling together in the strongest buildings started carving shelters into hillsides and riverbanks. Eleanor showed them how to angle the shafts for ventilation, how to reinforce with timber, how to stock food and water for months instead of weeks, how to trust earth more than air. By spring, the valley was different. Houses were rebuilt smaller, simpler, more temporary. The real homes were underground now, hidden chambers where families could retreat when the world above became uninhabitable. The town began to look less like a settlement and more like a collection of entrances to somewhere safer. Eleanor's shelter remained the largest. The central chamber became a gathering place. The storage rooms fed families who had lost everything. The sleeping chambers housed children orphaned by the storm and adults who had nowhere else to go. People who had called her mad now called her something else. Wise. Prepared. The woman who saw what was coming when everyone else was blind. They didn't apologize, not in words, but they apologized in action. They listened when she spoke. They followed when she led. They stopped questioning and started learning. Thomas Harlan dug his own shelter that spring, working alongside Eleanor to understand the principles. When it was finished, he stood at the entrance and looked back at her. "I was wrong about you. About all of it. I don't expect forgiveness." Eleanor was silent, then said simply, "I don't need you to be forgiven. I need you to be prepared. Next time, There might not be somewhere to run. He nodded and descended into his own shelter, his family following him underground, into earth that would protect them the way it had protected Eleanor. Martha's family dug a shelter too. So did the pastor, though his wife's body was finally buried in spring soil, and he worked with the steady determination of someone who had seen what happened when you put faith in the wrong things. Dutch helped Eleanor expand her ventilation system and taught her tricks about trapping heat in winter and releasing it in summer. The valley changed. The people changed. They became something harder, something wiser, something that understood the difference between survival and comfort. They learned the lesson Eleanor had tried to teach them without words. The world doesn't care about your beliefs. It only cares whether you're prepared when the test comes. By the time the first flowers pushed through the melting snow, Eleanor's hillside looked like it always had. Scrub pine and brown grass and a slope that led nowhere important. But beneath the surface, chambers spread like roots, connected by tunnels that families had dug to share warmth and resources, and the comfort of knowing they weren't alone underground. Eleanor stood at her shelter entrance one morning in early May, watching the valley come back to life. Children played in the mud that had been snow for 6 months. Adults worked on above-ground homes that everyone now understood were just temporary structures, places to live when the weather allowed. The real homes were below. The real safety was in the earth. Ash sat beside her, gray muzzle resting on her knee. The dog was older now, slower, but his eyes were still bright and his tail still wagged when Eleanor scratched behind his ears. "You did good," she told him. "You helped me build this." From below, voices drifted up through the ventilation shaft. Martha teaching her children how to preserve food. Thomas reinforcing a support beam. The pastor reading scripture in a tone that sounded less like preaching and more like hoping. Dutch laughing at some joke only he understood. Eleanor turned away from the valley and looked at the hillside that had saved them all. They had called it a grave. They had mocked her for digging it. They had watched her work and decided she had lost her mind to grief. They had been wrong about everything except one thing. She had been digging a grave. Not for herself. For the version of the town that thought walls and tradition would be enough. For the comfort of believing that winter would always be survivable. For the illusion that you could live on the surface and ignore what lay beneath. She had buried all of that. And what had risen in its place was something harder but more honest. A community that understood the Earth's lessons. That preparation mattered more than pride. That sometimes the people you ignore are the ones who save you. That survival isn't about faith or hope or prayer. It's about work and foresight and the willingness to dig deep when everyone else is building high. Eleanor descended back into her shelter, into the warmth and darkness that had become more home than any cabin could ever be. Ash followed, his nails clicking on the hard-packed floor. The door closed behind them. Above ground, spring continued its work, melting snow and waking seeds and pretending winter had never come. Below ground, Eleanor Brooks sat by her fire and knew better. They had mocked her for building a shelter. They had called her mad for digging into the earth. They had turned their backs when she needed them and come crawling back when they needed her. And she had opened the door anyway. Not because they deserved it, but because sometimes survival means saving people who don't deserve saving. Sometimes wisdom means teaching people who should have listened the first time. Sometimes strength means forgiving people who never asked for forgiveness. Eleanor poked the fire and watched the flames dance. Outside, the world turned. Seasons changed. People forgot and remembered and forgot again. But the earth remained constant. The earth held what it was given. The earth protected what went deep enough. And in the end, that was the only lesson that mattered.